Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Michael Sandler, your host on Inspire Nation. If you've ever wanted a completely different way to look at, perceive, and connect with the world, then do we have the Plant Intelligence and the Imaginal Realm show for you. Today I'll be talking with Stephen Buhner, author of Herbal Antivirals, Herbal Antibiotics, and at least 17 other books, including one of the most important, profound, and paradigm-shifting books I've ever read, Plant Intelligence and the Imaginal Realm. And that's just what I want to talk with him about today. Our connection to the natural world, how to cultivate a completely new realm of awareness, and what it means for our day-to-day lives. That, plus we'll talk about Barbara McClintock, Tom Sawyer Syndrome, butterflies in the first grade, sharing a metaphysical moment with Grandpa, Lyme disease and Japanese knotwood, white pine and Clark's Nutcracker, and what in the world can happen if it's the 60s and you have long hair in Texas. Gotcha. So welcome to the show, Stephen. Are you ready to shine?
Well, of course I am.
Excellent. So I want to start, maybe we go back in time a little bit, or maybe even a little bit more than a little bit. Would you mind telling us what first grade was like and why you liked it so much?
Well, first grade tends to be a fairly benevolent schooling experience, and I make a huge distinction between schooling and education, and I found that education wasn't all that present in my schooling. Nevertheless, in first grade, there's that transition period, and first grade teachers are often quite benevolent beings, and it was quite fun. In a sense, she allowed our childlike wonder and that beautiful childlikeness that small children have to be expressed and really come out. And so I was quite happy with it and thought, oh, this is going to be wonderful. And so it was in first grade anyway.
And then you showed up in second grade.
Second grade, I got one of those teachers that every one of us seems to get sooner or later. She wore a backpack filled with rocks to come to school, for her posture. And, she hit our hands with rulers and gave us demerits. And it was really a pretty grim experience. And in essence, the word school, the way I think about it, is like you school a horse. You train them to do certain things. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people like to believe that schooling is designed to bring out the best in people, to truly educate them in the enlightenment or liberal sense of education. But in fact, it's really more focused on schooling, much like horses or dogs. And that was my first experience with that. And I was pretty sure that I didn't really want to be involved in it anymore, though, of course, when I told my mother that, I was informed that I didn't have any choice, which all of a sudden seemed incredibly unfair to me. So that began my slow disinterest and really aversion to the kind of schooling that is common in the United States, which really came out of Austria and Germany more than anything else. And so it began a long period of disaffection, really.
And then I guess we'll fast forward to when you were 15, had long hair, and you're walking down the streets in Texas.
They understand that's 1967. And so what had happened is I'd started listening to the Beatles and Bob Dylan and the Rolling Stones, and the Summer of Love was happening, and there was all of this tremendous excitement in the air, civil rights protests and anti-war protests, and that rebellious rage somehow found a place inside of me, and this sort of box inside me opened, and this part of me that had become tremendously repressed during my years of schooling began to come out. Mm-hmm. And my parents had moved us from Kentucky to Dallas, Texas the year before, and it was a very, very bad time to grow long hair and be walking around because the powers that be then looked at everybody with long hair as being some sort of anarchist rebel. And I was arrested more than once for walking with long hair. And, so I was really foolish. There's two stupid things I believed from my schooling. One was that the Bill of Rights was actually in effect in the United States. And the second one was that science is the search for truth without preconception. So, I immediately started talking about the Bill of Rights and my desire for an attorney, which they thought was incredibly humorous. And so they said, well, we called your mother. She doesn't want you anymore, and we're going to just kind of leave you here. And that she did come and get me the next day, and I was incredibly terrified, but that pretty much took the lid off the box. And the next year I filed emancipation papers and hit the road with $50 in a Boy Scout backpack and went to San Francisco, and it was one of the best decisions I'd ever made in my life.
Now, you made it back into school briefly and then back out to Colorado?
Well, what happened was I went back to school, but when I turned 16, I filed emancipation papers and started living on my own. And when the school found that out, I was expelled, because people at that time, students at that time, were considered a tremendously bad influence if they weren't living with their parents. And, unwed mothers and anything like that, it was, all carefully hidden, and that expulsion dynamic was in place. So I worked for another few months and saved all my money, and then went to San Francisco, where I lived for 3 or 4 years, and then I left, and I was driving through Colorado. I wasn't really intending on staying here, but there's this thing that happens sometime where you're going someplace, you don't really know where you're going, and in a sense, I could describe it as saying that the winter weeds of depression and loneliness had grown so high I couldn't really see anything else, and I needed to get out of California, and so I just began driving, and I drove through Colorado, and this very strange experience happened. The place called my name, and it took me a while to realize that that's what had happened, but I ended up staying there, and I rebuilt this old 19th century, early 20th century teacher's cabin next to a one-room schoolhouse and lived there. And I ended up in Colorado for about 25 years, and it was absolutely a wonderful thing to do.
It's interesting. I ended up there for about 25 years myself. From 88 to 2011, 12, somewhere in there.
Yeah, what part of the state?
I started in Colorado Springs, then I migrated up to Fort Collins, and then I found home in Boulder.
I was in Golden, Colorado, which is just south of Boulder, and then in Boulder, and pretty much that area for the entire time.
And I met my wife after she had moved from Golden. She had moved west to the southwest corner of the state briefly, and then had just found her way to Boulder. So,
yeah,
interesting overlaps. So from there, it seems like people were an important influence or kind of learning tool, but you learn so much from people at the time. I was fascinated. I guess this is secondhand information, but it was really an amazing lesson what you learned from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and Golda from a concentration camp.
Right. Well, the thing is, I started to school in Golden at a community college, and one of the first classes I took was given by this remarkable man named Ben Sweet, as he would go, "My name is Ben Sweet, sweet by birth, sweet by disposition." And he was just tremendous. And then there was a class called On the Challenge of Being Human, and he was an astonishing man. And whenever he talked to us and asked us really tremendous questions that forced us inward to really think deeply, he was so present and so looking at us and really wanted to hear what we had to say. And I was taking other classes. I was majoring actually in mathematics, but taking all those other classes, that dynamic was missing. And then I finished there, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And I made this sort of really unorthodox decision, as a friend of mine put it. I thought I wanted all my teachers to be like that. And so I made this list of all of the teachers, all of the books I'd read by people who had really moved me. And I decided to just go into a University Without Walls program and then arrange it to study with all of those people, like Robert Bly or Buckminster Fuller. And so I thought, why have warmed, leftovers when I can have the real dish prepared by the original chefs, And one of those people happened to be Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And so I flew out to California and spent 2 weeks with her in a workshop she was doing, and she told this remarkable story. In a sense, what I was really doing was becoming educated rather than schooled. And there's this kind of transmission that happens. I mean, many young people are extremely hungry to find elders or mentors that are older who can transmit that thing, whatever it might be, from the older to the younger. And I didn't really know it this consciously then, but that's what I was really seeking, this kind of food from those kind of people. And so, you know, the workshop dealt with a lot of work, her work with cancer and a lot of different things. But one of the things that she said, somebody asked her how she came to her work, and she said, well, she was a young Swiss physician, and it was right after World War II, and she'd heard about the concentration camps, and she just couldn't believe it. So she went to this concentration camp in Poland, and she gets there, and there's these big gates where the trucks used to come in, and they were thrown back, and she goes in the gates, and right by the entry there was a table with this young woman, you know, probably around 20, something like that, with dark raven hair, and she had a pad and pen, and she would just take down the names of the visitors and, you know, act as sort of an informational person for them. And so Elizabeth gives her name, and then off she goes into the camp, and you could just sort of wander around. A lot of people were doing that. Then first she comes on these huge rail cars sitting on rusting railroad tracks, and the first one is open, and it's filled with hundreds, if not thousands, of children's shoes. And she's it hits her like somebody had taken a 2x4 and just knocked her over the head, and she's just standing there in shock. And after all, she moves on to the second one, and she can't quite figure out what she's seeing. And then all of a sudden she realizes that it's hair. That it's the hair of all of the people that had been killed there. They'd been shaved, and the hair had been saved to stuff into mattresses. And she said there's this moment when you encounter something that your world has no place for, and you can't ignore it, and you feel the entire worldview that you have cracking and crumbling, and you fall through some sort of opening into another reality, and for a time you're lost. And then after a while she kind of comes to herself, and she walks, and she goes into one of the barracks, and it's, you know, this very simple long wooden building, and with 3 bunk beds on either side down as far as you could see. And so she's walking through this place, and it's empty, and her footsteps are echoing on the wooden boards. And she said there was just this feeling of ancient grief and hopelessness in the place that was impossible to ignore. And she's so overcome that she's in some sort of mind state that she'd never been in before. She's walking along, and then she begins to notice that there's butterflies either drawn or carved into all of the wooden walls around the bunks. And it finally struck her that the children that had been kept there were doing butterflies on the walls. And she thought, how in the midst of this could the children do all these hundreds and hundreds of butterflies? And she's just caught by that, and she's standing there for a minute, and then she becomes aware of someone behind her, and she turns around, and it's the young woman from the gate. And the woman takes her arm and says, "Here, come outside. And this is hard." And so she takes her out and lets Elizabeth sort of come back to herself again. And then the woman says, "My name's Golda, and who are you?" And Elizabeth tells her, and Golda says, "Ah." And she says, I was here in this camp. And she points, and she says, the ashes and smoke of my family came up from that smokestack over there. And Elizabeth doesn't know what to say. And so the young woman says, we were brought here in 43, and she said they just took us, and they were shoving us into the the room with the gas, telling us, it was showers, and they're shoving us in and marking our name off as they put us in that line and shoving us in. And she said, my mother and father and my sister shoved in, and they pushed me in, but the room was so packed that the door wouldn't close. And so finally they pulled me out, slammed the door, and that was the last I ever saw of my family. And she said, but they didn't know I existed anymore because they'd marked my name off the list. And that's how I survived. And Elizabeth looks at her and says, but you seem so calm. How can you be so calm? And Golda looks at her very intently and says, because the Nazis taught me this, that inside each of us there is a Hitler. And if we do not heal the Hitler inside ourselves, these things will never stop. And Elizabeth said all of her work that happened after that came out of that moment in time.
Wow.
It was one of the most powerful teachings I'd ever experienced, and I thought, I'm never going back to school. I'm never going back there again. This is what I searched for. This is what I want. And those are the teachers that I spent my life finding.
How did you end up finding your way to the woods or to nature or to the plants and to see them? It's interesting. We might double back with it later. Jessica, my wife, she's the producer of the show, as I was telling you earlier. She's down in North Carolina right now, frolicking in the woods and literally asking the trees, what do I need to know right now? How did you end up starting down this path with, it'll sound wacky maybe to some people, but with true master teachers?
Well, the thing that happened, I was going to San Francisco City College in San Francisco before I went to Colorado, and there was this guy in my class. He was enormously old. He was like 32, and he had, after he graduated from high school, he moved to the mountains, and he had built a cabin in the woods and lived there for several years. And then after that, he had hand-built a sailing ship and sailed around the world, and he was shipwrecked by a typhoon on the coast of Madagascar, where he was found by this beautiful woman who nursed him back to health and whom he had inadvertently married by accepting some local fruit from her. And, and I heard this whole story, and I thought, that's what I want. I want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
It's like any 17-year-old would. When you hear a story like that, if you have any romantic or heroic impulse inside yourself, some part of you goes, that's what I want. And so I thought, yes. And so when I had gone through Colorado and I heard the place call my name, and somebody had then told me, well, you can just go find out who owns places that are abandoned and ask them if you can live there, if you can rebuild it. And many people will say yes, and that's, in fact, what I did. So he was really the inspiration for that. It's, that happens to, Robert Bly talks about William Stafford, the poet, and he said, William Stafford's life began with a right step. And for many of us, our lives begin with a wrong step, and we don't discover it until we hit middle age. And then that horrible depression ensues, and most people just make accommodation with it and continue, but some stop. But for me, leaving home like that was a right step. And then once you do that, these strange kind of serendipitous experiences begin to happen. The events that our soul needs for us to become ourselves begin to emerge seemingly of their own accord. And so the little cabin I found in the woods in Golden, Colorado, was my attempt to sort of recreate that experience that man had told me about. And so I lived there for 3 years, learning how to build an outhouse that didn't smell, and how to cut wood, hand-cut wood for the winter, and run a wood-burning stove, and, how to deal with 30 feet of snow over a winter and all of that. And there's this dynamic thing that begins to happen when we end up being able to spend time in silence with the wildness of the world. And there's something, a kind of awareness or a sensitivity that begins to emerge where we begin to hear the world speak. And, Aldo Leopold once said that if you go into the Gila wilderness and you listen for a long time, you'll begin to understand the song of its waters. And that was his way of grasping for that particular truth. And after being there so long, one of the things that I particularly loved about nature was its honesty. Nature doesn't lie. It's very clear what the rules are, and the subtleties of human interaction, of the kind of hidden agendas that occur amongst the human population are simply absent there. And that was my first real immersion in wildness, and it changed everything that happened afterward.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. I want to get into understanding a different way of viewing the world. And so hopefully this will take us on track rather than off track. But when you talk about nature and nature not lying, sharing as she is, maybe we need to look at what is brain chauvinism or the intelligence that's in the forest.
Well, there's a writer I particularly love named John Ralston Saul, who wrote a really tremendous book called Voltaire's Bastards, The Tyranny of Reason in the West. And one of the things that I've noticed over all the years is that movements that begin in all honesty and genuineness over time tend to be subverted by the most psychologically damaged members of that movement, because the other people move on. And reason was originally looked at as, a counteractant to the dogmas of the church and the oppressions of Christianity in the West. But the original founders of the Enlightenment, to them it wasn't dissociated mentation like it is now. I mean, reason in our time means dissociated mentation. I stand here, I look at everything over there, and you have merely an analytical or conceptual relationship with the world. And the feeling basis of our own humanity over time began to be removed from reason more and more thoroughly. It was labeled as a kind of emotive dynamic, and it was considered to be something that would interfere with pure reason. And so that process, and I think everybody born in our time, Edward Abbey had a great line in one of his books. He said, I was, like many people in America, I was born a displaced person, seeking for my place. Now that I have found it, I must defend it. But that concept of being born a displaced person, I think that a considerable number of the young suffer from that sense, a sense of alienation from the world and consequently from themselves. And so if you begin to step away from reason and begin to cultivate other aspects of our humanity, a different relationship begins to ensue. I mean, one of the oddities about me, and believe me, I'm neurally atypical from the beginning, but, I took some philosophy classes in college, and so we studied Descartes, who I loathe, but Descartes', axiom cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. The professor said that. She was quite actually a wonderful person, and she said that, but unlike most people, I wondered, is that true? And I thought about it for well over a year, and finally I decided, no, it's not true. What's really true is I feel, therefore I am. Mm-hmm. And I, began studying. I wanted to train as a theoretical mathematician, and I was quite good at it, and I kept going along for a while. But the more I did that, the more dissociated from myself and the world I felt. And so I abandoned that and decided to allow the feeling part of myself to emerge and to learn how to think through that. And the problem is the problem for many people in our culture, that the feeling aspect of the self begins to diminish the more you go through the schooling process. In first grade, it's sort of still there, but by the time you get to high school, it's considered quite a dangerous dynamic, and college even more so. And so if we try to reclaim that aspect of ourselves, it still is about 6 years old, and while our reasoning capacities are absurdly farther ahead, so it takes quite a long time for it to catch up. In other cultures that are different, that part of the self would develop right along with mental capacities, and so it attains a kind of maturity and sophistication, just like the ability to reason does. And I switched over to that and began to work with that, and sort of my rule of thumb was feel first, think after, if there's time. So, feeling is very different than emotion. They're not the same thing. People are very confused about that. But feeling is the thing that happens when you go to a new restaurant that, with a friend and you've never been there before, and you walk in, the two of you all of a sudden stop and you look at each other and you go, this place feels weird, let's leave. That's the capacity I'm talking about. It's the capacity for kind of a non-kinesthetic feeling perception of the world. And all people that worked closely with the natural world, and all the people I admire that I talk about in my book, that capacity was kept alive throughout their whole lifetime. Their science came out of it, their writing came out of it, their entire life came out of it. So the thing is that it's really impossible to establish deep relationship with the wildness of the world without that feeling capacity intact. And it's very difficult to understand a lot of things that happen in the natural world, in the wildness of the world, without that feeling capacity intact. That's why people that talk from this position, whether it's Albert Einstein or Luther Burbank or Barbara McClintock, when they speak from that place, rationalists who have sacrificed their feeling self to dissociated mentation, they literally can't understand what's being said to them. And it's why science in our time has been so perverted. I mean, I've been accused of being anti-science, and I'm not really. I'm anti-scientist in the way that it's practiced right now, because there's such tremendous flaws in their assumptions about the nature of human relationship and reason, so that the majority of the studies that they do are altered in a way that damages their actual utility in the world. And but being immersed for those 3 years in that cabin in the forests of Colorado allowed me to develop my feeling sensitivity to quite an exquisite level in encountering the natural world. Like many people have talked about this. You go, maybe you live in a city, but sometime you go out in wildness and you're walking along, and all of a sudden you encounter a magnificent old-growth tree or a great rock formation, and you stop for a second, and you're taken out of yourself, and there's this massive breathing in. Always you go, oh, and you're struck by something that's coming out of the world itself, some luminosity or some power that touches you so strongly that you're moved out of your thinking mind and into this deep feeling part of yourself. And it's that experience that most interested me in all of its subtleties. I mean, in a lot of ways, we get so screwed up by the way that we're raised in the West that it takes a cosmic 2x4 hitting us over the head for a while before we start to like look around and go, did you feel something, And that dynamic, so, training that part of me in its perceptual sensitivity, it took many years, but nevertheless, after a while, that kind of experience happens with even the subtlest of wild events. And, the thing is, it's not an unusual experience. Nearly everybody has it, and the usual example I use is puppies. You see a little puppy walking across the floor, and its back legs are walking a little faster than its front, and it's kind of catercorner, and it's smelling the floor, and you say, here, boy, and the puppy looks up, and in that moment, you feel something come out of the puppy into you, and something from you going into the puppy, and the puppy bounds over, and that experience, you're holding the puppy, and you just feel this incredible thing happening. It's one of the most important experiences we can have as human beings, yet we have no word for it in our language. That's how divorced from the feeling sense and from the inward life we've become. And that thing itself is the thing that most people are seeking and missing. The ancient Greeks, I got this from James Hillman, the ancient Greeks, the Athenians essentially, had a word for that experience. It was called aesthesis. It's the root of our word aesthetic. And it means an exchange of soul essence between yourself and the world. And at that moment of breathing in, there's an inspiration. I mean, the word for breathing in is inspiration. And the ancient Athenians were really clear that the source of inspiration for a life resides in the world itself, not in the human being. And that only by having that exchange of soul essence can an individual human being truly become human, but be inspired and also find direction for their life in interaction with the great powers of the world that we're surrounded by. So that's sort of that whole scenario. And to me, that's the fundamental aspect of deep ecology. It's the fundamental way out of the trap that we've been led into, because you can't think your way out of it. As Einstein said, the problems that we face cannot be solved by the same kind of thinking that created them. And he was really clear that it was thinking through the feeling sense that allows you to get where he himself got.
Thank you. So from there, let's talk about how we start to shift our consciousness and how we start to develop our senses.
Well, the thing that I want to emphasize is that these capacities for this kind of perception are inherent in human beings. Everybody has them to some extent every day of their life. And so it's merely a matter of recognizing their legitimacy and being willing to develop that as a particular aspect of perception. It's, and it's an eccentric decision in the way our culture is structured now. But one of the primary exercises that I give people is to, I lead them through kind of a guided meditation, and I, with their breathing and just relaxing and letting themselves be held by the place they're sitting as if it's two huge hands holding them, and just let themselves breathe and breathe and breathe, and then slowly open their eyes and look at the thing in front of them and ask themselves, how does it feel? And the great German poet Goethe put it very succinctly. He said, at that moment in time, there is an intimation of mood or feeling that belongs to the thing itself, not to the reasoning mind that's perceiving it. And you feel this, in that moment, you feel this kind of burst of feeling that you may not be able to describe. I mean, Stephen King's the only one I ever read that talked about that. He said in one of his books about a character, he said, one of the 1,001 unnamed feelings crossed his face. Yeah. So finding a way to describe those subtle shifts of meaning, because that's actually how we perceive meaning, is through our feeling sense, not through our brain. And the meaning of a restaurant, the meaning of a puppy, the meaning of a great tree, it enters us when we breathe in through this feeling capacity that we have. And so for probably 25 or 30 years, I would do that every day for at least several hours with everything that I encountered, quite often many hours more than that. And it begins to train you in these subtleties of perception to understand the very slight shifts of meaning. It's, in a way, it's like many people, not everybody, so it's not a great universal metaphor, but if you go into the ocean, one of the most sort of remarkable experiences is if it's on a warm day, you'll be in the water, and then all of a sudden you'll feel this current of very cold water come by you, and that was sort of an astonishing recognition that inside that huge body of water are all of these different currents doing different things that have different temperature ranges. But what we really do is we walk through a world of meanings, trillions upon trillions of them. It's like a sea of meaning, and there's these currents that flow through, and every so often one will touch us that stands out from all of the rest. And William Blake, but then also the poet William Stafford called this a golden thread, that we're touched by this meaning that somehow captures the attention of the conscious mind. And then if we have that feeling sense intact and we know of its importance, at that moment we turn and begin to follow that. And he said, then life itself becomes the most marvelous adventure of all.
Woohoo! You talk about in your book, how do we see what you call right in front of us rather than merely look at it?
Oh, that's the hardest thing of all. Seeing what right in front of us is the hardest thing of all. The poet Dale Pendle has that in one of his great poems, and it's just one of the most difficult things. We're trained to look at the surface of things, but not to see the things themselves. And that is very, very difficult, mostly because of our training. I mean, one of the things that took me the longest to learn is that all human beings, including myself, are fundamentally ignorant, and we will always be that way.
What does that mean?
Well, for instance, we know less than 1% of what happens in the ecological dynamics of the world. We know we're children counting grains of sand at the seashore, and that's what we'll always be. So, I mean, if you start beginning to look at the history of science, for instance, pronouncements made in 1880 are very different than those from 1920, very different from 1940, very different from 1980. And what happens is they're trying to find some sort of definitive way of saying this is what's true. But there isn't any kind of ultimate truth. I mean, Buckminster Fuller said human beings have a monological propensity for one-picture answers. The problem with the complexity of the universe is one-picture answers do not exist. And in a sense, the drive toward dissociated mentation or untethered reason, it's an attempt to escape the complexities of the universe from which we've emerged and which we remain embedded for all of our life. So we don't really know that much. And for instance, my examples from my own life are legion. I become very interested in plants during that time I lived in the mountains, and it began this interest in medicinal plants that, I spent many, many years involved in that. And my books take that information in ways I consider fairly obvious, but yet are extremely unique in the field. And so even though I had a massive amount of knowledge base about that, when one of my editors asked me to write a book on herbal beers, because she knew that I'd been making some spruce ales and things like that, when I did that, and I'm writing this whole book, it never occurred to me till I was deep in the book to ask myself, what is the medicinal quality of hops doing to people who drink beers? I mean, it just didn't occur to me to ask because the beer world's over there, the herbal world's over here, and there was no connection inside me between the two. And then, of course, I realized that because hops is the most powerful estrogenic plant on the planet, all of these people drinking extremely hopped beers, IPAs, were in fact loading their system with hormone replacement therapy. And as I traced it back, it turned out that the Protestants were the ones that had gotten laws passed to put hops in beer, in this huge kind of economic and religious fight with the Catholics back in the late 15th and early 16th century. And so that's what I mean. There's many things that we take as real, as fundamental axioms about the nature of reality, such as beers are made with hops, and we never question it. And those kind of belief systems, and that's just a tiny example, the belief systems that each of us possess are extremely complicated and extremely complex, and they have many, many, many layers to them, and they're like a pair of glasses that we're wearing over our sight, which shifts how we see the world. You know, the ancient Greeks and the Romans, they perceived that they lived in an animate universe. And that oriented their cultures in a particular way. We're trained that the only intelligent life form on the planet are human beings, and that everything else is essentially inanimate. I mean, we have animate and inanimate categories, but we don't really believe as a culture that plants are often more intelligent than human beings, that bacteria are by far the most intelligent life form on the planet, which they are, but it's taken centuries for that sort of belief system to begin to even nibble in a serious way at the foundations of our cultural viewpoint. So what happens when you begin to do interior work, or when you walk into the world, what begins to happen is the reestablishment of an animist perspective, which is really important because it's only when the exterior world is personalized that we begin to care about it enough to really protect it. It becomes not then merely resources to be used in the industrial machine for our benefit, but actually life forms that have their own destinies, their own purposes, their own soul existence that's crucial, and that all together we sort of sit in a circle of life, Ken, not masters. And that shift can only occur from a kind of a shift from the isolationism of being trapped in our own houses with no connection to the world outside, that shift from that to understanding that the world is animate and alive and intelligent and aware and souled, and in fact, it's their adventure too. And they like the companionship of human beings. So it's only by going to that place, making that transition, that I think we can really begin to see what's right in front of us. But nevertheless, I found, after living this way for most of my life, there's still so many layers of assumptions that interfere with me being able to do that. That's why I say that I'm in a fundamental state of ignorance, which will never change. It's just that, in a way, my degree of ignorance slightly lessens over long timelines.
Thank you for sharing. We'll ask just a few more questions, get into a brief wrap-up. Maybe time, I'd love to, if you have a minute or two, to take us through that meditation. What does it mean to be seeing with caring or seeing with friendship?
Well, one of my new favorite words is conviviality. And I have examples in the book of this moment in time that a lot of people have experienced that they wrote about, whether it's Thoreau or Albert Hoffman, it doesn't really matter. There's a number of them. This moment in time where I suppose the easiest time of day to perceive that is that transition period between late afternoon and evening. The light takes on a particular quality at that time where the world seems tremendously benevolent. And I would think that most people, whether in spring or sometime during that time of day, whatever, they have these moments, as they did in childhood, where they would experience this benevolence of the exterior world, and they would breathe more deeply and feel fulfilled in this particular way. Just kind of a natural happiness would begin to emerge. And that kind of state of being is one that each of us can inculcate in ourselves and develop over time, that once you begin to personalize the exterior world, to understand that the things that you encounter are alive and aware and ensouled just the same way you are, then you begin to experience those moments of benevolence more. It doesn't mean that you don't encounter difficulties, that the shadows of life are not things that you find. That deep depression does not find you every so often. I mean, Dale Pendle, when he was writing his great trilogy, the Pharmaco trilogy, he was living in the woods in California, and he put a sign over his door that said, "Demons welcome here," and then he laughs and says, "Too bad they already have the address." And that's true for all of us. Sooner or later, those things find our address and come to seek us out, and we go through the difficulties that sort of encounter with the shadow entails. Nevertheless, despite that, there's this tremendous benevolence that exists in the world when we begin to understand everything is alive just like we are, and we begin to see with caring then. We walk into a landscape and we notice that it feels slightly different than the landscape we were in before, and some part of our feeling self responds to it with a sort of gladness of spirit, and the place itself responds back to us. And in that moment, we begin seeing with these caring eyes, and that thing itself begins to change everything, because then the world itself begins to lead us in this tremendous golden thread to find our sole purpose, why we're here, what we're meant to do. And as Stafford said, life becomes the most marvelous adventure. Yeah.
Thank you. What is your number one? You've written so many amazing, beautiful books, and this I've read, I don't know, 400 or 500 books for this show. This is at the very top of my list because it's a complete paradigm shift of, I don't even want to say who we are in the food chain, because that is such a broken concept. But it is such a complete paradigm shifter. What is your number one aim or goal or hope or desire right now as you're teaching people and bringing your work forth to the world?
Well, I was so different, and my experiences only increased that difference. I mean, I prefer the term neuroatypical, which is a kind of innocuous term, which is why I like it. And the thing is, these kind of experiences were fundamental to me in my life, and I kept having them over and over and over again. Yet at the time that was occurring, there was virtually no literature in the world that I could find that would explain those experiences in any kind of a useful way to me. They were completely dismissed by most of the adherents of dissociated rationality. And so I thought, I don't really want any other human beings to grow up being unable to find somebody that's talking about it, not in a grandiose way, and, because that was a big point for me, to be common about it. And also, it's important that there be some sort of a map of the territory that makes sense, that comes from a Western context. And, I taught in New York years ago, and it was a miserable experience, except the three people who showed up, that was all that came.
Wow.
The trip wasn't worth it in that sense. But each one of them were quite unusual. They each had a story. I'll just tell the first woman. She had been born in Jamaica, had that wonderful accent, and she goes, I said, so why are you here today? And she said, because lately, man, I haven't wanted to live. And my grandmama, she come to me in my dreams, and she say, child, you have to get your fingers in the dirt. Child, you have to get your fingers in the dirt. And so I found a community garden, and you know what? When I put my fingers in the dirt, I know who I am again, and such a thing has never happened to me before, and I come today because I think maybe I'm crazy. And all three of them had a story exactly like that, right? So I knew then why I was there. But the thing is, there are so many people that wander through the world now, trapped inside their own houses, that every so often they'll have these experiences and they think they're crazy. And so the purpose of writing these books has been so that they know they're merely forerunners of the shift of paradigms that is occurring as reason begins to lose its hold, as it begins to lose its necessity in the Western cultures, because we really need to have a fusion of the feeling self and the reasoning mind in this way for our civilization to survive. It's the only way out.
Where compassion comes to mind.
There's a tremendous importance, and we see every day around us now a tremendous loss of compassion, loss of compassion for the livingness of the world, a loss of compassion for people who are different than us, whether they're, extreme right-wing Republicans or extreme left-wing, activists. There's this division between almost every subgroup now that makes it it's very difficult to bridge that. And one of the things that became a seminal thing for me years ago, I went to this woman. I was in a dark place and struggling, and she was one of my mentors, and she heard me talk for quite a long while, and she goes, oh, I see. You've been being a bridge, haven't you? Well, the only problem with being a bridge is that you yourself never get to cross over.
Oh, goosebumps.
And right then, it revealed to me, it was like this bright shining light that came on of a sudden that revealed my shadow on the wall, and I realized the reason why I wasn't crossing over was fear. That if you truly cross over and embrace that way of life, you lose a kind of relationship with community that's very terrifying. Mm-hmm. But yet the world needs people who are willing to cross over and speak not grandiosely, not out of rage, but simply about what the other shore is like, because that's where we need to go.
Thank you. What words of wisdom. Jessica, my wife, she's the producer. She's out in the forest right now, communing with nature and hearing what the earth has to tell her in North Carolina. If she was here right now, she would ask me to ask you what words of wisdom you would give for parents to help their kids today.
Well, I'm very much not a fan of television. It alters dynamics in the brain in a way that make it very difficult to embrace the kind of life I'm talking about. I consider it the most malign influence, really. And when our son was born, we just simply didn't have television, and we did other things. Sometimes we'd watch movies, but that's a whole different sort of dynamic. It wasn't like we were controlling what he watched because the range was broad, but we were controlling unlimited access to normal network programming. And that was just sort of the one thing that we did that might be easy to describe. But the other things that we did, see, to me, there's no such thing as kids. There's no such thing as children. What there are immature human beings, okay, that are as capable of reason and perception as adults, and quite often more so. So he was a part of our family council from the very beginning, and the more he could articulate, the more he participated. But we spent a lot of time together. There's this important transmission that occurs when parents spend time with their children and they work side by side, and that something goes from the elder into the younger child in that they need to breathe in. It's like a soul food that helps them become themselves. And because of the isolation between parents and children, that transmission is quite often non-existent for most people. That's one of the things that I sought throughout my life in being with elders, was that sort of transmission, because it occurred with my great-grandparents and to some extent, but not with my mother and father. And that dynamic was important. treating them as functionally intelligent and equal in their capacity to ourselves, it taught our son a sort of trust in himself that he never really got much anyplace else. And what's more, to try to see, it was very important for us to see him as he was, not some fantasized projection of what he was. And when he was born with an absolute fierce will that was present from the first week.
Mm-hmm.
And I was quite aware that in many families that will would have been broken to break him into harness and in the school system. So we very carefully adjusted our lifestyle to match his personality and his character, in a sense, so that we could respond to who he is. And that genuineness, I mean, children are quite susceptible to lies in a certain way, and they're quite perceptive about them. And we made a decision never to lie, never to answer any question he asked completely truthfully, so that he would be treated with this certain kind of respect. And that, as you can tell, these sort of dynamics that I'm talking about are very unusual for most people in our culture. I mean, he knew what sex was from an early age. Like, we weren't living on a farm, but all farm children are exposed to it from an early age. I'm not quite sure why it's considered to be offensive. There was no such thing as a bad word in our house. There's just simply words. It's the meaning inside the word that matters, that what you're using it for. And so there wasn't these sort of really nonsensical moral restrictions on his exploration as a human being. And that trust blossomed in him as a kind of a self-responsibility and a self-trust in himself that neither he nor his mother, and neither I nor my mother, Jesus. But anyway, his parents did not have that. We had particular wounds in us that he just didn't have, and as in consequence. And that's a big part of what I think is important to do with children, because it allows you to respond to who and what they are rather than what you want them to be.
Woohoo! From there, a few quick wrap-up questions. First off, what personally brings you the greatest happiness, or what I call the woohoo factor?
Those things are writing a great line. I mean, the newest one I'm working with today on a story I'm writing is called The Winter Weeds of Loneliness. There's times in our lives when the winter weeds of loneliness grow so tall that we can't see anything else. And that sort of thing, when you capture some invisible moment in language in such a way that it moves the soul, that's one of those moments for me. To be able to spend lengthy time in wild ecosystems that haven't been disrupted, to hear what the land itself has to say, that does it too. To read the great writings of someone I respect, and to be in close intimacy with my beloved, to share that undefended self, those are the kind of things that fulfill a life for me and the things that I follow.
Beautiful. And where can people go to find out more and to find your beautiful books?
Well, my books are Amazon, of course, is a great source for the majority of them. Our website is GaianStudies.org, which is GAIAN studies.org. And then, of course, I'm on Facebook, so I post things every so often there, and that's where they can find me.
Fantastic. Any last words of wisdom you want to share with people today?
The thing that I always like to end with is to say, trust what your feeling sense tells you. And don't let anybody ever convince you that it's not real, because that is the way out of the human predicament in which we find ourselves now.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Would you have time for a very brief meditation of helping people to cultivate this?
Well, sure. It's pretty much what I went through before, but it's just sit back and allow yourself to relax. take a deep breath and hold it, hold it, hold it, and release. And take another deep breath and hold it, hold it, hold it, and release. And as you breathe out, just let any tension in your feet flow out with your breath. Now your calves and your thighs. Let those stomach muscles go. And your hands, you don't need to hold on right now. Just with every breath, as you breathe out, let all of the tension in your body go. Imagine that the place you're sitting are two huge cupped hands holding you. Just let yourself be held. You don't need to hold yourself up now. Let the tension in your chest go, and your neck, and your shoulders, your face, your eyes. And when you're ready, just very slowly open your eyes and focus on what's right in front of you. And ask yourself, how does it feel? And in that moment, there'll be an intimation or mood or feeling that's unique to the thing itself. And wrap it up carefully in your heart cloth. And then do this again with something else. And notice in that moment when that intimation or mood from the second thing enters your awareness that there's a slight difference between the two. That's what this work is about. And that's it.
Woohoo! Thank you so much, Stephen. This has been a pleasure, a treat, a joy. I think important is an understatement.
Right. Well, thanks so much for having me on, Michael. It's been sweet.
Thank you so much, Stephen. For everyone out there, this is Michael Sandler saying, be well, have fun, get plant intelligence and the imaginal realm, and start diving deep, and shine bright. Woohoo! Thank you, Stephen.
You're welcome, Michael. This was a great interview. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like below. Also, leave your comments. Have some real fun with it. Subscribe to our channel where you're going to get more great videos, more interviews coming up. And check out our website, inspirenationshow.com. That's where you'll find tips, blogs, information, videos you won't find anywhere else, and useful and helpful resources to really help you kickstart your life and to shine bright. Thanks so much again. Thank you for your support. Like, comment, subscribe. See the website. Thanks so much and have fun. Of course, shine bright. Woohoo!